Well, hello everyone. My name is John Fyock. I am the Suicide Prevention, Community Engagement, and Partnership Coordinator for the Sioux Falls VA. Per request with the Sioux Falls Police Department, here providing some training to some of the new officers about an exciting opportunity that we see within the VA is providing some training and some education to law enforcement, potentially any first responders regarding some characteristic scenarios that you may encounter with a veteran in a potential crisis situation. So got some videos, got some slides. We'll go through some videos incorporated into that. So we will get started. Full disclosure, these are not the slides specifically developed by the Sioux Falls VA. It's actually developed by the VA National First Responder Training Initiative. So this slide lists all the various individuals from like Janet Gates is a social worker down working out of the Orlando VA. John Rocca is a police officer, I believe, with the Baltimore Police Department. So the other individuals, various professional backgrounds, but all with the specific focus of providing some training and some education to our first responders. And I think the individuals listed here would certainly say if there's any follow-up questions following this, any of them are certainly welcome and would be open to any emails or questions that you have. So why are we here? I would ask everybody kind of listening to this, obviously you don't have to respond, you'll be watching this as a video, but kind of just take a moment to think about what you're specifically hoping to get out of this. I mean, it's probably a required training for many, but really kind of deeper than that. Think about what you hopefully ought or hope to get out of this training. What I want to emphasize with any of the information, my background is I'm a clinical social worker. I'm not a police officer. I'm not a veteran myself. My father was Army. But what the information I'm going to be providing today, one thing to emphasize is that this is not a get out of jail free card. If you encounter a veteran that needs to go to jail, then it's your job certainly to bring that individual to jail. We're not asking anyone to veer from their department policies or procedures. We just want to really provide education on why some of the veterans that you encounter may be exhibiting behaviors that are maladaptive and how to get them to the help or the services that they need. We have to deal with the behavior that we see. We're going to talk about some of the techniques that we've seen be successful from other police departments. Tools to put on your tool belt if you encounter a veteran in crisis. Point of emphasis as well, not every single veteran that you meet is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or is in crisis. Many veterans are living very normal lives, are very successful, give back to their communities, but what we're going to talk about today are those who may be needing your assistance. They may be silently suffering, or it may be evident, but you may come across them and again, we always say one person can make a difference. A little background about myself. I've been working with the Sioux Falls VA for coming up on 9 years at this point. Started off in a homeless outreach role, switched to doing individual therapy with veterans about the last 6 years. Then the last year and a half have taken on this community engagement role. So really trying to work more in the community sector. And one thing that we've recognized is that first responders have a very significant opportunity to assist with veterans in crisis that can help them to get care that they need, help to de-escalate a situation. And the other reason that we're providing this is many veterans have shared that they want to become first responders, and we know from what we've heard from the officers that we've talked with that the information within the slides is also very helpful. Excuse me, just a rundown about our different training items that we'll be covering in the various slides. We'll go through some veteran demographics, current issues facing veterans community, role of first responders, post-traumatic stress. There can be, certainly be some misinformation out there, so hopefully clarifying some of that. Talking about veteran suicide prevention strategies, veteran contacts, first responders, some strategies, again, just some tools to consider, adding to the tool belt. Getting into some veteran-involved critical incidents, officer safety, hostage, barricade situations, some negotiation strategies, and then kind of wrapping up with some VA resources, specific contacts within the VA, Sioux Falls VA, for you to reach out to if needed. And wrapping up with some first responder wellness. Certainly want to emphasize the importance of self-care to the individuals watching and listening these videos. Just a little bit of disclaimer. Again, I think I've emphasized these just tools to add to your toolbox. Nothing contained within the contents of this presentation should ever replace basic officer safety considerations or agency policies. I certainly want to emphasize that. And also, point 2 talks about safety of everyone is important. Certainly, officer safety, subject safety. But again, for those individuals that need to be taken to jail, then certainly that needs to be the outcome. Point 3 on here, mentioning how we'll be presenting the information that may be interpreted, certainly as painting a negative picture of veterans, but always want to keep in mind that the vast majority of veterans, of all veterans, are honorable, law-abiding citizens, very much more likely to come to your aid than confront in a hostile situation. And as we mentioned before, it's not a get out of jail free card. Okay, some veteran demographics overall. So estimated about 20 million veterans in the United States, which makes up about 8% of the total population. Here in South Dakota, there's about 65,000 veterans, and more specifically in Lincoln and Minnehaha County, about 13,000 veterans. So certainly majority or more densely populated in Lincoln and Minnehaha County. Underneath that, it mentions a term probably many people are not familiar with, like the service connection. Nationwide, about 16% of folks have a service-connected disability. Basically, what service-connected disability is, if anybody in training during their tour, during their time in service, receives let's say they twist their ankle, and it's something that, basic training or in their service, and eventually they have to get, let's say, discharged from the service because of that. They can get a service-connected disability physically for something like that. Tinnitus with ringing in the ears. So basically any kind of injury that occurs during their service is what a service-connected disability is. So about 25% of veterans in South Dakota have a service-connected disability, whether physical or mental health-wise. Certainly see a growing number of females in the military. Unfortunately, with that also comes increased suicide rates. Currently today, about 15% of active duty is made up of women, and about 18% in the Guards and the Reserves. We include this slide to demonstrate that although many people assume that most veterans has served in war or, quote, combat veterans, vets who deploy to a war zone or actually even outside of the United States are actually in the minority. So even during this time of active war in the Middle East, most veterans were stationed in the U.S. Important to note that is that because there's a good chance that most of the veterans with whom you may interface are not combat veterans. Therefore, again, wanting to minimize the assumptions that whatever prompted law enforcement involvement may not actually have anything to do with their combat status. Just take a moment to look at this slide. So when we're thinking about veterans transitioning home, it's notable that for our most recently returning veterans, they are returning to a country where less than 2% of the total population between the ages of 18 and 34 have actually served in the service. This has implications as there are very few people who have had this shared experience and can understand exactly what he or she went through. Vastly different than the veterans who served, who returned home from World War II, for example, where a third of the country served in some capacity. After World War II, veterans returned home to the company of other veterans at home, work, or in social groups, and specifically, in regards to social support, which is the #1 protective factor against the development of post-traumatic stress. Lack of that kind of camaraderie or kind of shared experience is very notable. So we're seeing less and less individuals serve, therefore less and less of a peer network for those that have actually served. A little bit of education here with for instance, the war environment. So one helpful area to understand can be just what type of environment individuals or veterans saw for those post 9/11 conflicts. As far as providers, clinicians, we can certainly be helpful to understand kind of what type of terrain or environment someone served. So some veterans that were located in the heart of Baghdad, for example, were exposed to very crowded streets, locals, traffic, and city developments. Others may have been in the mountains in Afghanistan, which may have a whole different experience. As far as terrain goes, learning about the type of terrain and job someone had on deployment can provide additional information about potential health issues. Want to emphasize that this would not necessarily be information that you would have to gather, but as far as trying to establish rapport, with an individual in crisis, these can be some helpful areas or things to consider. One other thing regarding the war environment is access to technology. With increased technology, veterans may have increased access to home while on deployment. So it can be a great way to stay in touch with family, share pictures, updates from the home, and reassure loved ones of their safety. Some veterans, depending on their job location, may have access to a cell phone, where the others had to wait for internet stations or shared phones. Though this may be a positive, it could also pose additional stress to the service member or their loved one. For instance, if the norm was to communicate regularly and then due to a protocol or a communication blackout, the family may not hear from the veteran for a week or so. So not knowing could certainly raise anxiety and fear, as compared to other wars where letter communication weeks apart was the norm, and not hearing regular or having regular contact was the exception. Increased communication to home can also pose additional stress, as service member could be aware of home issues, say child not doing well at school, home repairs needed. The service member hears this, therefore concerned but helpless because they are how many thousands of miles away and not able to do anything. So it can certainly be a positive, that social media, but it can also be a negative depending on the circumstances. My back hurts, and probably something that individuals, first responders, depending on your occupation, could certainly relate to as well. Very common complaint amongst primary care providers at the VA is musculoskeletal issues. Veterans may have managed through their time in service, but are now dealing with chronic issues related to their back, their knee, their neck, or some foot issues. The reality is that they may be carrying 80 pounds or more of gear on a regular basis over time, which can have a cumulative effect or an impact on the body. Many veterans, like first responders, may rely on adrenaline, Motrin to help manage that, and for like service members while on deployment, but then later on finding very chronic health or chronic back issues continue to be around. And then again, to add in, increasing number of females in the service, in smaller frames. Therefore, female veterans very likely having potentially even more significant muscular skeletal issues because of smaller frames and still with that 80-pound rucksack. Millions and millions of dollars are spent by the Department of Defense. I know I've heard this at the VA. VA does a great job of training individuals to become soldiers, become the most powerful, effective military on the planet. Unfortunately, though, not much time has been spent transitioning them out of that role as they re-enter back as civilians. So it's unreasonable to expect that all of the training they receive is simply set aside or turned off like a switch. Okay, so quite a bit on this slide. I'm going to kind of highlight each area a little bit as far as just adjustment considerations. So first off, anyone deployed to a war zone is going to have some sort of adjustment considerations, whether that's post-traumatic stress or physical health ailment. They've still been away from home, away from families, away from their routine. One thing to consider is whether a service member has been deployed as active duty, reserve, or National Guard. So let's just say active duty by chance. Veteran potentially there is living on a base that has access to more supports, families may be around, and others going through very similar experiences. Upon return, they could likely come home to a steady income, stable place to live. Typically, the peer group for an active duty service member is made up of other service members who they are more familiar with and are similar in their current stage of life. National Guard or reserves, likely not on a larger base. Chances are there are not a lot of family or friends around who have had or familiar with their experiences. Veterans deploy at all different ages and stages of life, therefore it's important to consider this when working with veterans. The men and women are often holding dual roles, both serving their country in an official role in the military, while also holding down civilian jobs and routines. As far as war zones, transitions to civilian life, again, mentioned this, how the military spends a huge amount of money and time and resources to get service members ready to deploy, go to combat, battle, prepare for a mission. However, the reintegration resources and training are not quite as comprehensive. So many of the skills that they are highly trained, that have helped keep them safe and alive, don't translate well into everyday civilian life. A couple examples of that. Driving. Driving in a war zone versus driving on the U.S. highway. So there'll be a video embedded after a few slides here that will show a young veteran, driving through streets and having some triggers about, and therefore requiring him to drive pretty fast and erratic. And in a war zone, that was necessary to help keep him alive. If that were to happen in the States, that could potentially lead to a very dangerous situation, speeding, hitting somebody accidentally, whatnot. Another example with that transition is service members, veterans can often feel more comfortable with a weapon with them at all times. Heard many individuals talk about how just having that firearm next, on their side offers that extra sense of security and safety for them. And so we'll talk some in a few sections here about suicide prevention, but lethal means safety and the safety of individuals And so many find that firearm to be a safe, to help keeps them safe. However, if they are going through a traumatic, like say triggering event, having that loaded firearm can definitely pose at a risk if they obviously turn it on themselves. Unemployment certainly could be a challenge. The skill set that they had within the service may not always transfer back into the civilian side. And so we want to help veterans draw upon their skills and values in a way that helps them be successful in civilian employments. Upon getting out of the military, many may not have a higher level of education, so it can be difficult to find a higher paying and satisfying job. But there's also many that take advantage of their GI benefits and return to school, which is certainly good for job potential, but it can also be an extra added stress, as if they return, students are very likely to be much younger than them, and very different views, maybe politically or as far as war, just not have as much life experience as the returning veteran. Relationships, certainly deployments affect relationships and families. There's often an expectation that when the veteran returns home, things will be fine, go back to normal, but family members have learned to adapt to a life with the veteran gone. And it can take time to reestablish the roles of family members and norms. I have heard a lot of stories about veteran members missing deployment and the camaraderie that they became accustomed to. It's not unusual to hear from a family member that they've changed or that the veteran's different. And veterans counter that by often stating people, that they just don't get it or they don't understand. Substance use-wise, many veterans come into care for untreated substance use. This could be a result of maybe medications from an injury that were prescribed in service, or self-medicating from both physical or mental pain. It can often be tricky because it could certainly be socially acceptable behavior in the military to help get them or to connect with others. And so it's important to determine whether the use is related to self-medicating or numbing. Well, again, there'll be a video that'll highlight a lot of these things that that I'm talking about here in just a little bit. Many veterans may use alcohol to help with anxiety, the hypervigilance or hyperarousal, and use it as a way to cope with difficult situations such as being in large crowds or at a social event. Military sexual trauma, for those unfamiliar, MST is a sexual assault or repeated threatening sexual harassment that occurred while the veteran was in the service. It affects both males and females. We're certainly seeing, historically, I think more so people might think of this as like females, happening to females, but we're certainly seeing more and more men come forward as well. MST is often not talked about and is certainly underreported in all branches of the military. One reason for this may be perceived repercussions and complexities with rank. Veterans may be uncomfortable being searched or patted down by an officer of any gender, regardless of their gender. So be cautious and aware that one may have negative previous experiences that may affect their behavior in a crisis situation. Traumatic brain injury, or TBI, may happen from a blow or a jolt to the head or an object penetrating the brain. So when the brain is injured, the person can experience a change in their consciousness that can range from becoming disoriented and confused to slipping into a coma. The person might also have loss of memory for the time immediately before or after the event that caused the injury. So TBI can come from the head being struck by an object, such as a bat or a fist during a fight, the head striking an object, such as a dashboard in a car accident, or the head being affected by a nearby blast or explosion. The shock waves, can certainly be something that rattles the brain. TBIs can cause a number of difficulties for the person who's injured. This could be physical changes, changes in the person's behavior, or problems with their thinking skills. After an injury, a number of symptoms might be noted, such as headaches, dizziness, problems walking, fatigue, irritability, memory problems, or problems paying attention. Veterans surviving blast injuries and head traumas are much more common in recent conflicts. This is due to increased access to medical care, technology, improved equipment and gear. But that being said, we still have many veterans who suffer head injuries with varying degrees. Physical health. Physical health is another thing veterans often, or physical pain is another thing veterans often endure. Physical health issues may affect readjustment through inability to perform at work, school, frequent doctor visits, inability to participate in social activities. They can be tied to mood disruptions, sleep issues, irritability. The individual may have caregiver needs from family, spouse, or have parent involvement. So it certainly can be a challenge for parents of adult children or grandparents, and even the veteran who may have less independence due to their medical caregiving needs. The stigma of mental health is certainly still present, unfortunately. Seeking treatment for mental health can be difficult, especially in the culture like a military. One may be worried about their clearance for a job advancement. Many guards and reservists did not seek help or fear it would affect future deployments. This is true. This certainly could be true for those seeking work as police and firefighters as well. So although there has been a lot of discussion on these issues surrounding suicide prevention and post-traumatic stress, the perception of seeking mental health services as a weakness unfortunately still exists. And include in there on the bottom like the sense of purpose. As in my individual therapy role prior to this, I think a significant portion of folks that I would see were lacking some kind of sense of purpose. And so, helping individuals, and I think this is true for anybody struggling, maybe just, a big part is that they're missing that sense of purpose. And just I pause here because I think we do have a video of why veterans miss war in here. It's a TED Talk with Sebastian Younger included.
I'm going to ask and try to answer some ways kind of an uncomfortable question. Both civilians, obviously, and soldiers suffer in war. I don't think any civilian has ever missed the war that they were subjected to. And I've been covering wars for almost 20 years, and one of the remarkable things for me is how many soldiers find themselves missing it. How is it someone can go through the worst experience imaginable and come home, back to their home and their family, their country, and miss the war? How does that work? What's it mean? We have to answer that question, because if we don't, it'll be impossible to bring soldiers back to a place in society where they belong. And I think it'll also be impossible to stop war if we don't understand how that mechanism works. The problem is that war does not have a simple, neat truth, one simple, neat truth. Any sane person hates war, hates the idea of war, wouldn't want to have anything to do with it, doesn't want to be near it, doesn't want to know about it. That's a sane response to war. But if I asked all of you in this room, who here has paid money to go to a cinema and be entertained by a Hollywood war movie, most of you would probably raise your hands. That's what's so complicated about war. And trust me, if a room full of peace-loving people find something compelling about war, so do 20-year-old soldiers who have been trained in it. I promise you. That's the thing that has to be understood. I've covered war for about 20 years, as I said, but my most intense experiences in combat were with American soldiers in Afghanistan. I've been in Africa, in the Middle East, Afghanistan in the 90s, but it was with American soldiers in 2007, 2008 that I was confronted with very intense combat. I was in a small valley called the Korangal Valley in eastern Afghanistan. It was 6 miles long. There were 150 men of battle company in that valley. And for a while I was there, almost 20% of all the combat in all of Afghanistan was happening in those 6 miles. 150 men were absorbing almost a fifth of the combat for all of NATO forces in the country for a couple months. It was very intense. I spent most of my time at a small outpost called Restrepo. It was named after the platoon medic that had been killed about 2 months into the deployment. It was a few plywood bee huts clinging to the side of a ridge, and sandbags, bunkers, gun positions. There were 20 men up there of 2nd Platoon Battle Company. I spent most of my time up there. There was no running water. There was no way to bathe. The guys were up there for a month at a time. They never even got out of their clothes. They fought, they worked, they slept in the same clothes. They never took them off. And at the end of the month, they went back down to the company headquarters, and by then their clothes were unwearable. They burned them and got a new set. There was no internet. There was no phone. There was no communication with the outside world up there. There was no cooked food. There was nothing up there that young men typically like. No cars, no girls, no television, nothing, except combat. Combat they did learn to like. I remember one day, it was a very hot day in the spring, and we hadn't been in a fight in a couple of weeks maybe. Usually the outpost was attacked, and we hadn't seen any combat in a couple of weeks, and everyone was just stunned with boredom and heat. And I remember the lieutenant walking past me, sort of stripped to the waist. It was incredibly hot. Stripped to the waist, walked past me muttering, "Oh God, please someone attack us today." That's how bored they were. That's war too. It's a lieutenant saying, "Please make something happen, because we're going crazy." To understand that, you have to, for a moment, think about combat not morally. That's an important job to do. But for a moment, don't think about it morally, think about it neurologically. Let's think about what happens in your brain when you're in combat. First of all, the experience is, it's a very bizarre one. It's not what I had expected. Usually you're not scared. I've been very scared in combat, but most of the time when I was out there, I wasn't scared. I was very scared beforehand and incredibly scared afterwards. And that fear that comes afterwards can last years. I haven't been shot at in 6 years. And I was woken up very abruptly this morning by a nightmare that I was being strafed by aircraft 6 years later. I've never even been strafed by aircraft, and I was having nightmares about it. Time slows down. You get this weird tunnel vision. You notice some details very, very, very accurately, and other things drop out. It's almost a slightly altered state of mind. What's happening in your brain is you're getting an enormous amount of adrenaline pumped through your system. Young men will go to great lengths to have that experience. It's wired into us. It's hormonally supported. The mortality rate for young men in society is 6 times what it is for young women from violence and from accidents, just the stupid stuff that young men do. Jumping off of things they shouldn't jump off of, lighting things on fire they shouldn't light on fire. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. They die at 6 times the rate that young women do. Statistically, you are safer as a teenage boy. You would be safer in the fire department or the police department in most American cities than just walking around the streets of your hometown looking for something to do. Statistically. You can imagine how that plays out in combat. At Restrepo, every guy up there was almost killed, including me, including my good friend Tim Hetherington, who was later killed in Libya. There were guys walking around with bullet holes in their uniforms, rounds that had cut through the fabric and didn't touch their bodies. I was leaning against some sandbags one morning, not much going on, sort of spacing out, and some sand was kicked into the side of sort of hit the side of my face. Something hit the side of my face. I didn't know what it was. You have to understand about bullets that they go a lot faster than sound. So if someone shoots at you from a few hundred meters, the bullet goes by you, or hits you obviously, half a second or so before the sound catches up to it. So some sand sprayed in the side of my face. Half a second later, I heard da-da-da-da-da. It was a machine gun fire. It was the first round, first burst of an hour-long firefight. What had happened was a bullet hit 3 or 4 inches from the side of my head. Imagine, just think about it, because I certainly did. Think about the angle of deviation that saved my life. At 400 meters, it missed me by 3 inches. Just think about the math on that. Every guy up there had some experience like that, at least once, if not many times. The boys are up there for a year. They got back. Some of them got out of the Army and had tremendous psychological problems when they got home. Some of them stayed in the Army and were more or less okay psychologically. I was particularly close to a guy named Brendan O'Byrne. I'm still very good friends with him. He came back to the States. He got out of the Army. I had a dinner party one night. I invited him, and he started talking with a woman, one of my friends, and she knew how bad it had been out there, and she said, "Brendan, is there anything at all that you miss about being out in Afghanistan, about the war?" And he thought about it for quite a long time. He finally said, "Ma'am, I miss almost all of it." And he's one of the most traumatized people I've seen from that war. "Ma'am, I miss almost all of it." What is he talking about? He's not a psychopath. He doesn't miss killing people. He's not crazy. He doesn't miss getting shot at, seeing his friends get killed. What is it that he misses? We have to answer that. If we're going to stop war, we have to answer that question. I think what he missed is brotherhood. He missed, in some ways, the opposite of killing. What he missed was connection to the other men he was with. Now, brotherhood's different from friendship. Friendship happens in society, obviously. The more you like someone, the more you'd be willing to do for them. Brotherhood has nothing to do with how you feel about the other person. It's a mutual agreement in a group that you will put the welfare of the group, you will put the safety of everyone in the group above your own. In effect, you're saying, I love these other people more than I love myself. Brendan was a team leader in command of 3 men, and the worst day in Afghanistan, he was almost killed so many times, didn't bother him. The worst thing that happened to him in Afghanistan was one of his men was hit in the head with a bullet in the helmet, knocked him over. They thought he was dead. He was in the middle of a huge firefight. No one could deal with it. And a minute later, Kyle Steiner sat back up from the dead, as it were, because he'd come back to consciousness. The bullet had just knocked him out. It glanced off the helmet. He remembers people saying, as he was sort of half conscious, he remembers people saying, "Steiner's been hit in the head. Steiner's dead." And he was thinking, "I'm not dead." And he sat up. And Brendan realized after that he could not protect his men. And that was the only time he cried in Afghanistan, was realizing that. That's brotherhood. This wasn't invented recently. Many of you have probably read the Iliad. Achilles surely would have risked his life or given his life to save his friend Patroclus. In World War II, there are many stories of wounded soldiers who were wounded, who were brought to a rear base hospital, who went AWOL, crawled out of windows, slipped out of doors, went AWOL, wounded, to make their way back to the front lines to rejoin their brothers out there. So you think about Brendan, you think about all these soldiers having an experience like that, a bond like that, in a small group where they love 20 other people in some ways more than they love themselves, you think about how good that would feel. Imagine it. And they are blessed with that experience for a year, and then they come home and they are just back in society like the rest of us are, not knowing who they can count on, not knowing who loves them, who they can love, not knowing exactly what anyone they know would do for them if it came down to it. That is terrifying. Compared to that, war psychologically in some ways is easy compared to that kind of alienation. That's why they miss it, and that's what we have to understand and in some ways fix in our society. Thank you very much.
So, as far as like our veterans being resilient, research we've talked about challenges faced by veterans, especially as they return to civilian status, but also, again, can't emphasize this enough to help outweigh it, that it's important to remember that the vast majority of veterans are doing very, very well. You know, they're going to school, starting families, obtaining jobs, volunteering in service organizations, contributing to society. Their skills are definitely needed and valued. Also need to acknowledge that most veterans do not need special considerations when interfacing with law enforcement, and very unlikely to face legal charges. In fact, they're much more likely to come to your aid than be involved in legal challenges. Lastly, at least 25% of first responders are veterans. Their skill set fits nicely with the needs and responsibilities of these types of jobs, and the continued ability to serve their communities through this type of work is valued by many veterans. But we also know that many are struggling. The statistic is out there that we lose about 20 veterans a day to suicide. That number is about 2 to 3 times the rate of civilians, which is especially notable given that only about 8% of our U.S. population has served in the armed forces. Even more notable is that of those 20 veterans that die by suicide a day, 14 of them have not been actively engaged in VA treatment. So it's a significant challenge then because we're not adequately reaching veterans in need. Thus, a major reason why we're reaching out to law enforcement population, because those individuals may be more of a touch point for those veterans in crisis. For those unfamiliar, there is a national crisis line, call it the Veteran Crisis Line. The VCL, as we call it, is a major referral source as local VAs are notified of the call of those veterans in their catchment area. Local VA staff can then reach out to the veteran and try to get him or her connected to care. So the VCL started back in 2007. Since 2007, almost 4 million calls. They've recently also added, realizing some of the younger veterans more familiar or comfortable with chats or text messages, so they've added those options as well. And the most notable, I think, with this slide is that of those, since 2007, there's been almost 120,000 dispatches of emergency services. So it's definitely a number that people are familiar with. Some of you may have heard that the FCC has recently approved of a 3-digit 988 number. I want to emphasize, though, that's currently not up and operational, but in the near future, I don't know when that will be, that 3-digit number will seem to be taking effect. And with this slide here, what we want to highlight is just how law enforcement plays an important role in identifying our veterans in need. Again, I use the term touch point. If we can increase the number of touch points within our community that do come into contact with the veteran, then again, specifically for us at the VA, if 14 out of the 20 we're not seeing within the walls of the VA, we want to increase the number of touch points within the community that can serve as allies or helpful individuals, to those veterans. Let's see. One critical, I'd say, common sense way is through collaborating with all of you, our first responders. As you know, any of the issues above can evolve into situations that prompt contact with law enforcement. So that could be drug, alcohol, mental health conditions. Someone may be in financial troubles, they just lost a job. Certainly they may create a crisis situation. Relationship problems, untreatable pain, legal problems. So any of these scenarios could certainly create a situation where law enforcement may come into play.